Okay. Well, thank you for seeing us so early in the morning and all that. So hope we didn't disturb you or anything.
No.
Okay. Great. Say I'm doing a book on the X-15 program. There's never been a book on the entire program, so we're trying to cover the whole thing from beginning to end. Whatever. Just like to find out your experiences on the program, anything special that happened for you, and just some other information about you in general, if you don't mind. I understand you were a test pilot at Pax River. Can you tell me something about your time there?
Yeah, I went there in I guess 56. Went through test pilot school. Was there when they decided to send a Navy guy out to the X-15 program. At that time, I was teaching at the test pilot school.
How long
That
did you?
was in early summer of 1958.
Okay. So were you involved in the development of the program at all, or were you chosen for the program after the X-15 was pretty well completed and ready to fly?
Well, as far as ready to fly, it rolled out in August of 1958. They rolled one of them out in a rollout ceremony, but it was not ready to fly, and it was, let's see, the first flight was in June, was it 59? And so it was a year later that it flew, but the program was formulated and the money had been appropriated, and they were constructing the 3 aircraft. When the Navy got serious about sending somebody out to be in the program. And having decided that at what level, I'm not exactly sure. I think probably at the Bureau of Aeronautics here in town. The people at Patuxent River felt that it probably ought to be one of the people from Patuxent River that ought to represent the Navy in that program. There was no formal selection process, but they considered several guys, I think, that were down there at that time, including me, and some of them weren't terribly interested in the program. I was chosen to go out, and I reported out there in August 1958.
Did you actually volunteer for the program, or did they come out? And
They
just...
called me in and asked me if I was interested, and insisted I go and talk to my wife about it. She didn't seem to have any objections, so I guess you'd say I volunteered.
When you were first chosen for the program, was there a specific period of time that you knew you'd be on the program, or was it just an indefinite tour?
It was an indefinite tour, and I was assigned to the NASA high-speed flight station with a set of orders that didn't have any specific time that I would be there.
Were you ever involved in any of the other Navy research aircraft programs, such as the Skyrocket or the Sky Streak?
No, I had not been involved with any of those. I'd followed them. I'd been interested bystander, but I had not been involved in any of those programs. The D558 Phase 1, Phase 2. No, I had not.
Were you involved, or were you aware of any of the other proposals that the Navy had? I understand that just before the X-15 program, they were coming up with an idea for a research aircraft along their own lines just for the Navy, like the D558 was their own aircraft. Were you aware of any of those proposals at all?
I was aware that there were people that considered, but I'm I'm not aware that they considered him real seriously. That is, had any significant backing for him. And the Navy, of course, was represented on the
Good morning.
Morning.
Research Aircraft Committee, I believe it was called. They had a representative on that committee, and it was that committee that formulated the X-15 program. Probably as good a time as any to mention that the Air Force was chosen as the executive agent for a joint research aircraft program, the X-15. As a result of problems with the X-2, there were definite agreements on exactly how this program was going to be conducted. The primary difference being that NASA would be in charge of the operational aspects of the program, rather than the Air Force, who had been on the X-1 and the X-2, in operational control, at least through the early stages. Most of the records are then. A joint program is funded by agreement that all parties will take part in it, but all parties don't necessarily have a line item in their budget to cover it. The Air Force used to say, we bought the ticket, therefore we want to take the ride. I think that's incorrect, and I think the people that said that really didn't understand the program, because they went to Congress to get the money, built the airplanes, and when they went to Congress, there was testified that it was a joint program supported by both Air Force and the Navy and NASA, or NACA at that time, and Congress appropriated the funds. Had the Navy not been a member of the joint program, they probably and a party to the whole program and in agreement with the way it ought to be run and how it was formulated, they probably would have been over there to get funds to do what you mentioned, build their own sort of research airplane and do the things that they thought needed to be done. So it was not funded by the Air Force. People at Edwards never did understand that. Fortunately, it was not a major issue out there.
Do you feel that the Navy thought that they got slighted in the program then because of their Air Force attitude?
No, I don't think that. But your question about was I aware of what the Navy was doing? Those things never came to fruition because the Navy joined up in a joint program with the Air Force and the NACA called the X-15. And had they not been a part of that, then they would have been competitors for the funds that went to the X-15 to build something which they might have felt that they needed themselves if they hadn't been a joint participant in the X-15.
Okay. When you first joined the program, how were you involved in the training for the program? Were you involved in the centrifuge runs at Johnsville and things like that? Or did you go straight to Edwards and get right into the program?
Well, I went to Edwards and got settled into an office with the NACA high-speed flight station. Well, let's see. It was only a few months after I got out there that NACA began nucleus for NASA. It was called NASA rather than NACA, but it was still a high-speed flight station at that time, which is now Dryden Research Center, called the Dryden Research Center. I went out, got acquainted with the people, got an office, and became immediately involved in the program. It's eventually, most of the early centrifuge runs had been completed when I got there, but there were a lot of later centrifuge runs, and we spent a lot of time in Johnsville working on various aspects of this program and other space-involved programs and projects, I should say, that NASA was interested in and had been assigned to the high-speed flight station for prosecution. Well, yeah, I spent a lot of time at the high-speed flight station through the years. I immediately became involved in the program. There were simulators that were being run continuously at that time down at North American. We hadn't moved the simulator up to the desert yet. Became involved in working on those runs that were made to examine various things that they wanted to get done with the program when it got started flying, and so forth. When it did start flying early, with Crossfield doing the demonstrations for Rockwell, I was a chase pilot on a number of the flights, or was involved in one of the ground control stations and monitored the data and so forth. I would say that I was a full-fledged member of the pilot team and took part in as many things I wanted to. There was no question Navy was not going to make the first government flight, but I'm not sure that's...
The Air Force had their name on it.
Yes.
Well, Joe Walker, NACA made the first, made government flight. Joe Walker made the first one, and Bob White the second, and then I was the fourth guy to fly the airplane, but they had both had, I guess, had 2 or 3 flights when I made my flight. First one.
And you brought up a good point there. With the Navy involved in the program, just out of curiosity for a trivia kind of thing, their X-15 was painted. It had Air Force, it had NASA. Do you know why Navy never got their name on it?
That was one of the things they used to say, so you want to give us a couple $100 million, we'll put Navy in there.
Okay.
But as I said earlier, I think that those sorts of arguments don't take into consideration what the real facts were in terms of funding it and how the program was originally formulated and so forth.
You mentioned the North American simulator. How was that in comparison to the real thing? I know it didn't actually move or anything, but was it a very good simulator?
Yes, it was an excellent simulator. It had no motion base, but was an excellent simulator, and we used that same simulator throughout the program for preparing the pilots for individual flights, ironing out various engineering aspects of the flight to make sure that what they planned to do could be done, looking into various variations in stability and so forth to see that if the area into which they were going to look at in the next flight, the aircraft had a little different characteristics than they had predicted for it, that you would get yourself in a pot full of trouble and not be able to handle it and so forth. Excellent, so. And grew a lot in terms of energy management and those sorts of things throughout the program. Was eventually moved to the high-speed flight station up there and used up there. But originally, for the first year or 2, was done at North America.
Can you tell me more about your preparations for your first flight? Like how many times did you fly, take simulated flights and things beforehand?
Well, let's see. I went out there in August of 1958, and my first flight was in September of 60. 2 years plus. The whole 2 years was preparing for that flight. Engineering problems, investigations, committees that were looking at various aspects of the aircraft that were learned. Crossfield had one of them kind of came unglued at one of the major fitting points and looked terrible. Sitting on those sorts of boards, sitting on committees or boards associated with new control systems that were being built for and planned to put into number 3 airplane, and all of those things which all of the pilots were involved in, was preparation for the first flight. Specifically, probably 6 or 8 weeks before the first flight, we would firm up what you thought you were going to do on that first flight and would begin perfecting your technique to do what was expected on the simulator interchange with the engineers if you thought they were asking you to do some things that you might not be able to accomplish or wanted you to do more than you really thought you had time to accomplish, and all of those things were normal for almost every flight, depending on the flight, maybe more critical than the other. In my first flight, I was not going into any area that anybody else had not already been a number of times. First flight was just out to Mach about 2.5, I guess, and supposed to be. And so I spent 2 years and a couple of months preparing for first flight, my first flight.
You were ready.
I think everybody was ready whenever they flew the airplane while I was out there. I left there January '62, and was not. I can't comment directly about what happened after that time. Not that I think there needs to be commented on, but I just don't know. I went back to the Navy and didn't have time to go up there and see what they were doing, how they were getting on.
Was there then for your flights after that, you did all the engineering things for your first flight, then really doing that major preparation. How long did it take you to prepare for flights after that?
I would say that you became intensely involved in the actual execution of a particular flight, probably 4 to 6 weeks before the flight got going, with a crescendo of effort and percentage of time spent on that direct preparation for that flight, getting going up as you got closer to the flight. You would one of the things you do with a particular flight is the profile would dictate how far you would proceed with the flight. And of course you wanted to end up at Edwards, so the profile would dictate where you're going to drop the airplane. We always required that under any circumstance, if the engine didn't run at all, if it ran for 1 second, or all the way to scheduled burnout, or not to fuel exhaustion and burnout, that if it quit at any time in there, that you would have a place that you could put the aircraft. And we practiced on the simulator getting into those places. You'd take the simulator down to about 25,000 feet. Then you get in a 104 and go out and practice the rest of that approach to that particular point, assuming the engine quit at a particular point. So there was a lot of work in 104s at emergency landing site to make sure you were very familiar with getting into that site should circumstances require you to go. And it paid off on a number of occasions. But, there was a lot of 104 approach and landing practice at various lake sites depending on the profile of where you were going to make the initial drop. Then, of course, continued work on the simulator to get the data that the engineers expected to get on that particular flight, and perfecting the techniques to get the particular data. Well, sometimes you would have arguments about how you're going to get this data, or pilot techniques that you might use in case some of the aircraft characteristics were different than predicted. But those were, well, I think the sort of engineer-pilot differences that probably characterize any program of this type. Engineers get on a simulator and fly it a great deal and then become very proficient at it. It doesn't necessarily mean that they can get in the airplane and accomplish that. And we sometimes have differences of agreement as to what we ought to do under different circumstances. But we never had any real pilots always won.
You got to fly the airplane, so you got to do what you wanted to do when it came down to it.
No, we didn't do what we wanted to do. We had to do what was prescribed to be done to get the data, because that's the reason the taxpayers are paying all that money, is to get some research data. That's the only payload you had. But those things that would happen and the things that you ought to do if that happened were the sort of disagreements that you'd have, and sometimes the way that you would get a particular piece of data, to get the airplane going through some kind of an oscillation and would it record its motions at that particular condition, how you upset it to get it moving around, and so forth, were some of the disagreements that we'd have. I'd say control techniques that you might use to accomplish a specific thing. They dictated what was to be accomplished, but how it was accomplished, what control inputs you use to get that condition, was something that the pilots always won on if there were an argument. There were a few little ones, but I don't want to imply that they were too serious or in any way developed. They were friendly differences of agreement that happened under reasonable men can disagree on almost anything.
That's true. When you were flying the X-15, later in the program it got into a lot of experiments. Were you involved in that at all, or were you just involved totally in flight testing?
I was involved in some of the planning for those as when I left there in January '62, the original flight objectives had been achieved. There were areas within the flight envelope that had been established at that time that they wanted to get more data, but there was a great deal of interest to use it as a platform to do other things, just use it as a platform to get experiments up into the or outside the atmosphere. It was the only vehicle we had that could do that at that time, so there was a great deal of interest. Filtering devices that would try and determine if there's some particulate activity up there or some kind that you could catch on the filter and bring home. The star tracker that was built into one of the aircraft was being considered and funded and defined at that time, although it wasn't in the aircraft at that time. Those sorts of things we were involved in as knowledgeable people on the program to help serve on committees and things to consider.
As for the flight itself, how long would you get, or how long before the flight would you be getting into the aircraft? Spend several hours on the wing, or?
Well, you would get strapped in the airplane normally about an hour before your scheduled taxi. There were a lot of checkouts that were accomplished in that continuing hour before you were scheduled taxi, and frequently there were delays of some kind where this didn't quite check out and people had to look into it. So it was not uncommon to spend 2.5, I guess, one time spent about 4 hours in before taxi. Normally, it was you were there and dressed and planned to get in and strapped in and squared away and start working with people on the checkout procedures at that point about an hour before scheduled taxi.
How was the ride up on the wing itself? Was it pretty rough out there? Was it pretty smooth?
Was not rough. Even in rough air, the old B-52 had springy enough wings and things that it wasn't a rough ride. The only rough part of the ride, when you first started taxi, those damn wheels had flat spots on them. Felt like you were taxiing over tuba-furs on them. Takeoff sometimes, it was no rougher than takeoff on anything. Well, it wasn't a rough ride out there.
How long were you usually in the air before a drop would occur?
About 45 minutes to an hour.
Was there many times, like when you were on the ground, when you had to hold, did you have to hold in the air for many occasions?
Oh yeah, sometimes it didn't even drop.
Yeah.
I can't remember how many times we aborted and didn't drop, but at least 3, maybe more than that, out of the 5 flights which I made. On one occasion, the auxiliary power units wouldn't check out. We aborted. We couldn't jettison the fuel. We made the landing on the B-52 with the aircraft weighing 20,000 pounds more than we'd ever anticipated making a landing with it, but we didn't have any problem.
B-52 still came in fine.
Oh yeah. Yeah, they had some real pros flying the B-52. Charlie Brock, John Alves. Not John Alves, what was the first? Alavie, I remember. They were excellent.
What was the launch itself like?
Well, the launch was a combination of a crescendo of checkout procedures and situations where you get up to the point not too many seconds before the launch that everything checked out and you were going to launch. And at that point, you could launch yourself, or the B-52 pilot could launch you, or the guy in the back end monitoring the top off of the fuel systems and the checkout of the aircraft had a console from which he could actuate the release mechanism. So anybody could do it. We agreed to how it was going to be done before a particular flight, who was going to do it. On the first one, I let them launch me. I think after that, I think I launched myself and the rest of it. Very simple procedure. You got a little wing drop when you came off of there. No particular sensation, but you were immediately involved in getting the engine running and getting established on whatever flight profile you were on. So the drop itself was, and the whole aircraft was easy to fly. As long as you were prepared for the things that happened, and there weren't too many unforeseen things that came that caused difficulties. You practiced a landing in a 104, and the 104 had exactly the same lift, drag, and everything. The only thing that different was the visibility was considerably different out of the 104 and the bubble canopy, but the visibility was not bad in the X-15, and when you put the flaps down, you got a little trim change in a different direction you did on the X-15, but those were both very minor things. So you could practice in the 104 until you felt at home. As a result, we never had any difficulty with that. It was very simple. We had practiced it in the 104 until one thing that a Navy guy could get an airplane from the Air Force to fly anytime he wanted to. If he scheduled the X-15 and he wanted the 104, they'd give it to him.
That was a good deal. Yeah. So the 104 was an excellent simulator. It did a very good job on simulating the landings of the X-15. Very close to them.
Super. Almost the exact characteristics could be achieved in a 104 in terms of lift and drag. The 104 had a high-speed gear. You could put the gear down and leave. You could put them down anything less than 300 knots, and we usually use 300 knots as the approach speed. If everything went the way it's supposed to, you go a little slower or a little faster to vary your flight plan if you weren't exactly where you thought you were going to be. Really, I think that that's one of the reasons that the program was so damn successful. One, you had a simulator that you could really perfect the techniques that you were going to use to achieve the data, to get the data that was desired on a particular flight. You could really hone that down to perfection. and you could practice landing under emergency or normal flight termination circumstances with a 104 to your heart's content. And it wouldn't be uncommon to go out and make 75 or 100 landings with a 104 in a week or so before we go out to X-15.
Very early in the program, or possibly before the program started, they were doing some simulations in F-100s also on landings. Were you involved in any of that, or were you just solo?
I was not North American. Did that. Crossfield did it with a little rogue chute that he used back there to achieve lift drag. But the 104 was much better, much better. I flew the F-100 a couple of times, but and we had F-100 if we had wanted to use it for that purpose. The 104 was better. There was no disagreement about that I know of among the pilots, government pilots.
During your time on the X-15 program, I heard that you were involved in some other programs out there. Is that true? Did you work on anything else?
NASA made me gave me an office. I was in office with Neil Armstrong and Jack McKay and Joe Walker for 3.5 years out there, I guess. And we were all in the same office. They gave me a desk. They made me one of their pilots, and I was involved in all of the programs that were going on at NASA. I was in F-107, that we had an X-15 sidearm controller that Jack McKay and I worked on extensively. I was the designated pilot for a program to send up a rocket which would at the apogee would release a balloon that had some iodized crystals, and these would vaporize and fill up this mylar balloon. And then the balloon being a specific size and weight and so forth, they get on it with radar and track it, and they could get atmospheric characteristics that they couldn't get any other way. You could send that thing up to about 500,000 feet. And, even if you had a balloon out there, you wouldn't get much above 100, and the X-15 times went up over 300, 355 or 60, I guess was the highest. That was a project to get information to help them reduce the data. It was never a terribly successful program because we never, when we get the rocket up there, we weren't sure whether the balloon could. We couldn't find the balloon if it did come out. But in the meantime, they wanted to fire this thing vertically and supersonically, and that's a very difficult condition to achieve. We had a lot of fun trying to get the 104 with a Genie rocket launcher on it out there, which Air Force had one of, I think, with a little rocket that would fire vertically. And they wanted to be supersonic so that it wouldn't have to go through after it left the launch rail. It was not guided. It just went in the direction that you pointed it. It wouldn't go through Mach 1 after you fired it. Maybe the resultant shock waves would knock it off its intended flight path. But trying to go vertically, supersonically, pretty tough.
Did you actually fly any of the flights that released the balloons?
Yeah, I flew all of them. We released, we fired, I guess about 4 rockets and never found any balloons. We also had a joint program with the Navy over Point Magoo to get an infrared weather sensing thing. And you didn't fire this one vertically. You'd fire it up pretty high, but maybe at 45 degrees or so, and this rocket would go out there for 400 or 500 miles. After it got going, a couple of IR sensing things would come out, and it would send back a picture of the cloud cover. We didn't have any weather satellites at that time, of course. That was not terribly successful either. The one I fired over there, the rocket reason we were firing rather than Navy, if the military, U.S. military were going to fire, we had to qualify it in a way that would cost a hell of a lot more money than we had to spend on it. NASA could fire it without qualifying it. All they had to do was form their own committee and decide that it was safe, which they did. And it was not unsafe, except that it was a cheap rocket, sort of a thing that they used on rocket sleds. And one of the two I fired over at Point Magoo, it apparently burned a hole in the side in a rocket that went sideways and hit one of the islands out there. It didn't hit anybody.
Because it's the difference between experimental and operational.
Mm-hmm. That's right. That's right. And those circumstances are still true. There's an outfit called Flight Systems Incorporated. That's a pretty good-sized organizer. A guy named Laidlaw was the president. I think he sold it a year or two ago. That has a bunch of airplanes, then they can go out and do things for you at a much less cost than you can do them yourself if you comply with all of the qualification things. And so we hire them to go out and do things for us frequently because they can do it. They're willing to take the risk on a program, and regulations and laws and things prohibit us from taking that kind of risk.
Yeah, they're a real good outfit up there.
A real interesting assortment of aircraft.
At Mojave, you mean?
Yes. Yeah, been up there several times.
Their headquarters down at Orange County, I think. No, it's a good outfit. It's a good outfit. They've got a couple of Navy 104s that I was involved in for 3 or 4 years before I retired, trying to let them keep. I never had figured out how they get parts for them. Midnight small stores at El Toro, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's right next to where I live.
Yeah.
Just south there. Getting back to the X-15, can you tell me how was the aircraft to fly? Was it easily controllable? And, any specifics on that?
I'd characterize it as relatively easy to fly because it generally followed predictions in terms of characteristics, and you could practice particular aspects of a flight so thoroughly that there were no unknowns. And you could practice a landing, and landing was, even if you had landed at a place other than where you intended when you started out. You had practiced at that particular site sufficiently, you were thoroughly familiar. No problem. They did pack the maximum amount of data acquisition and therefore pilot activities during the flight that they could to get the most data they could out of it. So you didn't have time to look out the window and see what the scenery looked like or things of that sort. We were busy doing every second, doing something involved in getting the maximum amount of data that we could out of that particular. That's what the tech there paid for. So I would say that as a result of the ability to prepare thoroughly, that it was not a difficult aircraft to fly. And those flights that I made, of course, you're aware, of course, that Major, what's his name, the guy that made the last flight and lost his life. Something happened with that flight. And I have not read the accident report, so I don't know about that. I've talked to people. That report is still classified. But something happened to him that was uncharacteristic and apparently very difficult because he didn't went in with the airplane. But while I was there, and I think that the other guys would not disagree with me, the ability to prepare for those things that were going to happen to you was so good that it was not difficult to accomplish. And, you know, a faithful simulator that allowed you to determine whether it was going to be difficult or not, and if it was going to be difficult, then modify it so that it was not that difficult, and your probability of doing exactly what was desired would modify. It wasn't difficult. There were some characteristics and some sensations that were a little surprising the first time. And that big engine hitting you like a catapult shot and then hanging on to you for however long you were going to let it run. If it was full power for 80 plus seconds, that's like taking an 80-second catapult shot, which only takes about 2. And a lot of people would strain against those forces. That would be about 1.5 Gs or so initially, but pretty close to 4 Gs at burnout. And we would strain against that initially, but I think we learned very quickly just to relax and against the support systems that were in the seat, and we could make control inputs a lot more accurately that way than we could fighting against the force.
I believe on your first flight you had a premature engine shutdown. What happened on that flight?
Yeah, that was with the small engine, which was 2 engines, really, with 4 little chambers in each one. That flight was scheduled just to go around the lake at Edwards. There were launch over Rosamond Lake. I guess probably 3 places where you pull G's and change course so that you, with a sort of a circular path around Edwards Dry Lake, it ended up on the north end of the lake going south from Amy. Launch was normal. Light off was normal. Both engines lit off. Went into the first turn, and I got indications that one of the engines had quit. One of the 2. 4 chambers, and you had lights, indicators in the cockpit that tell you if everything was normal, and I had lights that told me that one engine was not normal, and I felt the drop in thrust, and I immediately got busy going through the procedure of repriming the pumps on that engine and getting ready to start that engine. In the meantime, the aircraft slowed down very rapidly. I'm not sure. I think it was probably about 1.8 or so when we went into that first turn, but I'm not exactly remember what the mountain was. There's a flight profile around someplace that tell you that. Anyway, in the process of doing that, Joe Walker, who was flying in the 104 and had the primary landing chase responsibility, caught up with me. And about that time, the airplane began to fly pretty goddamn poorly, I thought, with one engine, although we had never practiced what to fly like with one engine. And he caught up with me and he said, "Hey, you don't have either engine." And we very rapidly concurred that we would dump the fuel and land at the south end of the lake going north rather than the north end of the lake going south. We dumped the fuel and did that.
Didn't have any problem with jettisoning that time?
No. Well, no. And as a matter of fact, standard operating procedures were that if you could not get rid of all of the fuel, there was a few hundred pounds of residual fuel in there depending on the attitude and so forth. But if you were unable to dump the fuel, you were prohibited from landing. Your standing operating procedure was to bail out. You didn't land with fuel forward. landing gear and aircraft, the whole thing was not designed to handle those kinds of loads.
Did you ever get in a situation where you thought you might have had to bail it out for any reason?
Well, yeah, on my last flight the engine didn't run as well. And that was at launch at Tonopah, but Mud Lake was the primary emergency landing lake, or the emergency landing site for launch and no engine. They drop you at 45,000 feet, you're doing about 0.82, but that's only about 260 or so indicated. And when you drop off of that B-52, you're going to hit the ground someplace within 3 minutes if you don't get an engine running. So you got 3 minutes max. You can hit the ground a lot faster than that if you don't utilize the glide capabilities of the vehicle. You drop off, and on a large engine, you got it going normally in about only a couple of 3 seconds because you just had one hand. With a small engine, you had to hit 8 of those individual rocket switches to get all 8 rockets running, 8 chambers running. I dropped off of there, it lit, it ran about a second and a half and turned itself off. And all of the lights indicated that it turned itself off. Now you go through a restart procedure, which is priming the pumps that pump the fuel, and that's primary liquid oxygen. You want to make sure that there is no gaseous oxygen in that pump when you start it up. It's got to be down to minus 350 degrees, like the liquid oxygen has, and have liquid oxygen in it, or it won't pump liquid oxygen. It'll cavitate and not pump anything. And so that takes about 20, pretty close.
Let's see. You flew the first flight that was designed to take data on heat transfer. How was that type of a flight profile different from a normal flight profile?
I flew the first flight that was specifically designed for the achievement of heat data. They got heat data on every flight to the degree that they could, but the getting kind of heat data the engineers want was really not compatible with high altitude maneuvers. What they wanted for heat data was a situation where you stabilized as many of the various parameters affecting heat transfer and generation at one condition. And that was, I think, one of the real reasons why the X-15 was a very useful tool. You could, rather than going through a regime either accelerating or decelerating that you could do with rockets, it was possible to stabilize a lot of things which affect the transfer and generation of heat, and thereby get data about heat transfer and so forth that they're just very, very hungry for that kind of data. And so what you would do is establish the condition in which you want to stabilize, and the one that I think you're talking about was a Mach 5 at 80,000 feet. And they wanted angle of attack, they wanted altitude, they wanted the Stanton number, they wanted Reynolds number, all of these things constant.
Honey, excuse me, can I make you all some coffee?
Oh, no, thanks.
No, I'm all right. Now, for that kind of flight, you would launch, rotate to climb up at the particular angle, and then depending on the angle achieved at a particular altitude, you would dump it over to come level. And in this case, 80,000 feet is about between 60 and 65. They dump it over, and then as you were, of course, at about Mach 3 or so climbing up there, as you push it over, and that was with full throttle. As you pushed it over and accelerated, you approached Mach 5. You brought it back. And this was a throttleable rocket engine from 0 to 50%. Later, they made it from 0 to 30% Brought it back 50%, and as you got to Mach 8, and presumably you were level at 80,000 at that, then you had to roll it into pretty close to a 60, 70 degree bank and pull about 3 or 4 Gs. At that point, the speed of the airplane would remain constant in this turn. And if you did all that perfectly, you get about 13 seconds of stabilized data. And that's what they wanted to get. I actually came level at about 85,000 feet. I pulled the throttle back with it, stabilized it about Mach 5.3 instead of 5. But we held angle of attack constant and had about 4 Gs on it. And most of these things fairly constant. Not exactly. But the heat engineers were ecstatic about getting this kind of data. They claimed learned a great deal. I don't think anybody argue with that, but I'm not a heat expert, so I think.
You were also assigned a program to evaluate special control techniques that were supposed to alleviate some problems that I think Joe Walker and White had on some previous flights having to do with angle of attack. What was that involved with?
At Mach numbers above Mach 3 and high angles of attack, the shock waves coming off of that thing were such that the bottom side and the control surfaces, namely the vertical stabilizer on ventral, on the bottom was about 5 or 6 times as effective as the one on the top, because it was sort of in an expansion field. That situation resulted in this one being so effective and this one being so much more effective than this one, that the aircraft flew differently, and the dihedral effect specifically was different than anybody had ever flown an airplane before. Normally you slide you put a little side slip on the airplane, it raises that wing. On this one, you put a little side slip on it, and that wing will go down. Because what you're doing is putting side slip on this thing down here, and it's just like another wing. And being in that high, being so much more effective than this one, it would roll you. Now, that is sort of a static situation, and we knew that situation exists, but we were not aware, because nobody had ever flown an airplane with that kind of a stability derivative in it, or that characteristic. But when you combine that with all the other aspects of the airplane, you ended up in a thing that could get worse and worse and worse. And how do you, if you get into this, how do you control it? And that's one of the arguments that we had with engineers. There was a thing called the beta dock technique, and there were an awful lot of people throughout the country involved in that. Princeton Aeronautical Engineering Division, and the chairman of that thing was a guy named Cortland Perkins. He got involved in it. One of the 2 or 3 of his professors, who were experts in stability derivatives and dynamic situations, got involved in it. I wrote a report for industry along with a guy named Joe Weil, which told everything we know about it as we got up with it. The engineers would say you could sit there, and as the nose went this way, you pulse it this way, and as the nose went this way, you pulse it that way. Well, it's very easy to sit there in a simulator, and the simulator wasn't moving. You'd look at these little instruments, but if you got a little bit out of phase when you put these things in, you would, rather than correct it, you'd make it a lot worse. And that was one of the difficulties, one of the arguments we had. The engineers sat down there for hours and hours and hours, and they got so they could do it perfectly on the simulator. And we argued you couldn't do it in the air. And after I got this heat data, I went on up to 100,000 feet at higher Mach numbers as it slowed down, and established it and displaced it a little bit, and took a look at this situation, and it wasn't as bad in the airplane as it was predicted to be in the simulator, and could be handled unless you lost some of your artificial damping that was in the airplane. And there were 4 channels of that, and there were a couple of those channels, the roll and the yaw to roll, called the yaw channel. If you lost those 2 and kept the other 2, it would have been an extremely difficult thing to fly. And as a result of that investigation, the adaptive flight control system, which we put in the number 3 aircraft, built by Honeywell, had just a great many more redundant things about those channels to make sure that you didn't end up without any artificial damping in the aircraft, and it never was an issue in flight, because we didn't lose those 2 channels simultaneously. But that was an investigation that concerned a great many people. It also resulted in taking that lower ventral, which we used to drop just before we landed, because it stuck down lower than the landing gear, and the parachute recovered. Taking that off, and the last 40, 50 flights were made without that on there. And we put that on there initially to handle the situation where you didn't have the engine thrust aligned to go perfectly through the center of gravity, and which meant that you would burn out with a misalignment that you had taken care of as you increase speed by adjusting these control surfaces. But as you burned out, it would be a sudden upsetting moment because you didn't have the thrust, but you still had these control systems out here misplaced to correct for misalignment of that thrust. We didn't think we could predict exactly where the thrust vector was going to go and get it through the center of gravity. One, we may not know where the thrust vector is exactly, and two, we may not know where the center of gravity was exactly. Turned out that was not a problem. And we put that lower ventral on there to be able to take care of that upsetting moment that would occur at burnout. So that you had a lot of things to correct that upsetting moment. So we found that we could very accurately adjust and make sure that the thrust vector went through the center of gravity, and we got rid of the lower ventral. That also got rid of that stability problem.
Did you ever fly a flight with the lower ventral removed?
No, I didn't.
No, that was all later in the program.
Yeah.
After you came in and landed, what were your procedures following the landing?
There were some shutdown procedures that you had to go through, shut down the auxiliary power units, and turn things off in general, but that was a relatively simple set of checkoff lists. You always had help. You could, I guess, get out of the airplane, unstrap yourself, and open the canopy, but it would be pretty difficult. But we always had people at any anticipated landing point to help you get out of the airplane. It was not like the space shuttle or anything. You had to sit there for an extensive period of time. And the uncanning procedures are much more complicated. But that canopy was very heavy, and you didn't want to blow it off if you didn't have to.
Well, would you have to blow it off if you had to do it yourself, or could you raise it from the inside?
You could raise it from the inside, but it was pretty heavy. And that was a cumbersome sort of a flight suit, you know, built in a sitting position. And get yourself unstrapped and make sure you didn't hit a bunch of switches that might turn something on instead of off.
Like the engineer.
And you had, you know, your helmet was fastened up to oxygen hoses. The suit and the ventilation system was attached up to nitrogen hoses at various places. Getting all of those things disconnected so you could step out of there without crawl over the side. You could do it yourself, but it was nice to have help. But and landing, rollout you couldn't control, you just rode it out. I guess you could change the direction a little bit by early in your rollout putting the control stick in so that you would put a little heavier load on one of those skids than on the other, and that would cause you to turn. We did determine the maximum amount that you might be able to turn it in case you needed to at some time. And it was a very small degree, but it would result in 300-400 yards maybe a difference in where you ended up after a mile of rollout. And the rollout was about a mile generally.
Can you give me your impression of some of the other pilots that you worked with? Or everybody get along pretty good?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, they were all great guys. Bob Rushworth, who made more flights than anybody in the airplane, was particularly, I thought, a really super guy. But they were all fine fellows. Walker, Jack McKay, were the pilots when I was there. Later on, Mel Thompson and Bill Dana became pilots from NASA, and Joe Engel, Pete Knight. I still can't say that guy got killed.
It's Mike Adams.
Adams, yeah, Adams. Most of the Air Force guys. Rushworth stayed there for a very long time. White left not too long after I did. Well, they're all a great bunch of guys.
You still keep in contact with any of them?
Oh, yeah.
Everything about having an X-15 pilot get together or something?
Not specifically, I guess, but we have been together. Most of us are members of the Society of Experimental Test Pilots. They have an annual bash out at Hollywood every year. Jack McKay, of course, died. Joe was killed in 104 collision with the B-70. Bob White is, I've probably lost touch with him more than any other guy. Bob Rushworth still living out in the desert someplace. He retired recently from Dayton. Vice commander, I think, of the Air Force Aeronautical Systems Division in the Air Force. No, and of course Neil is still around.
Yeah, I'm going to be interviewing him next week.
And Bill Dana's out there. Bill Thompson's out there. Pete Knight is still out at Edwards now on duty. Joe Engel is still in the Air Force, or he was a year or so ago. I haven't seen him for years. They're all around. Great guys, all of them. All of them. Scott Crossfield, super guy. I get along with Scott perhaps better than some of the guys did. There was a little animosity because Scott came from the NACA group up there and been a pilot up there, and then he left NACA and went to work with Rockwell specifically on the X-15 program, and was making, of course, a lot more money than the guys. No, I made a great many. I think one of the things that I am most grateful for is the fact that we made so many associations while I was out there during those years, and a great many of them have withstood the test of time. We're still good friends.
You mentioned that you probably lost contact with Bob White more than anybody. Seems to be the case I found with pretty much everybody. Do you know anybody who might know where Bob White is? I haven't been able to locate him specifically. Last I heard, he was in Germany somewhere.
Last I heard too. I'd go to the Air Force. They certainly must have some kind of locator system.
Yeah, good. That's going to be my next thing. I was hoping somebody might have an address for him somewhere.
I heard that he'd gotten divorced. I don't know whether that was friendly or unfriendly action. Remarried. There may be a lot of reasons why we haven't seen him around. I haven't seen Bob since he went out and he was sent back as the head of the flight test center that was brigadier general. And I saw him at that time a couple of times. I haven't seen him since.
Well, can you tell me more about your career following the X-15? When you said you weren't assigned for any specific period, but you left in '62. What precipitated your leaving? Did you anticipate you'd be there longer, or was it just time to leave?
I had no idea how long I'd be there when I went out there. 3.5 years is a long time to take out of a young naval officer's career if he intends to pursue a career in the Navy. I feel that I probably could have stayed there as a research pilot with NASA if I had wanted to, but that would have required probably that I get out of the Navy and go to work for NASA. And I never went through any of those procedures, so I can't guarantee you that that would have worked out that way. But I had that feeling. My association with the people out there, and the fact that I was just like one of their pilots while I was there, particularly the last couple of years, and they kept me busy doing all sorts of things. And I liked the work and I liked the people. So I had that feeling. So I also was at a point where one of the brownie points in a Navy career was had to be fulfilled pretty quick if you're going to have a successful naval career, namely have a command of an aviation squadron. And I had been selected to get a squadron, but of course it was not available while I was on the X-15 program. So I had to face a choice. You want to stay there and continue to do the research sort of things that would be done out there and get out of the Navy and hopefully get a job at NASA, or get back in the Navy and get back to the swing of things and be a naval officer and work that direction. And it's not an easy choice to make, but I decided that I would like to get back in the Navy. So I did.
So it was your decision that it was time to leave to go back, or did the Navy approach you again to say, do you want to come back at this point?
It was my decision. I had a sponsor here in Washington, and I used to come back and talk to him periodically, and he agreed that, you know, if I intended to pursue a career in the Navy, that I ought to probably get back and start doing some of the things they expected naval officers to do rather than research pilots. Because that was all very interesting out there, but the guys that are in charge of the Atlantic Fleet and the Pacific Fleet and so on and so forth were not terribly interested in contributing to that, or if you did that long enough, they would have serious doubts about your usefulness to them if you came back to work for them. So it was my decision, with a lot of discussions and advice from people who were helping me at that time, including my sponsor, who was a guy named Admiral Shea, Bill Shea, who died a year or so ago. Great deal of help to me. I wouldn't even have been able to stay that long and get back in had not he gone to bat for me a number of times. He made sure that my name was considered for a squadron. I was on some detached duty with some outfit called NASA that nobody, Navy personnel knew anything about. My fitness report was written by civilians.
What's a civilian?
So on and so forth. Well, that was a decision I made with a lot of help and advice and support from other people. I didn't regret having made it. Although that was very interesting. And I've had a wonderful time in the Navy since I came back, and I did before I came back and got a squadron and was in that squadron, but it wasn't there very long. They pulled me out to go to nuclear power school and had my work over, and then sent me to the Enterprise. I was executive of the Enterprise for 2.5 years. Went to Washington for a couple of years, went back and had an amphibious ship as a command, was later then command of the planning officer of the Enterprise, was selected for flag rank at the end of that time, which was about 1971. I did a tour in the Office of Secretary of Defense and Test and Evaluation billet. I had the carrier task forces in the Mediterranean for a year or so. I came back to Washington as the Vice Chief of Naval Materiel, was the Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Air Warfare, and then went to the Naval Air Systems Command for about the last 3.5 years before I retired in 1980. I had a lot of fun. I can give you a resume that has all that stuff in it if you're interested.
Okay, yeah, I would. I think everything that I've got just covers up through the X-15 program. So interesting what you've done after that. How long were you in the program after you decided to leave? Did you just pick up and leave a week later, or was the decision made and say?
No,
you
no,
might be
the
leaving
decision,
6
as I
months?
recall, was made in November, December of 59. I mean 61. And I got a set of orders that said I had to leave NASA in January of 1962. And I made that attempted flight up there in early January. And they were going to try and reschedule it by the end of January, but Jim McKay came up with some anomalies in the loads data on the landing gear at that landing up at Mud Lake that I made. And we really couldn't get the thing turned around and try again before, so I left on the 30th of January and went down and joined the Navy again.
Have to re-swear you in and everything.
Yeah. I like it.
But how many years were you in the Navy altogether then?
I was commissioned officer 36 years, and I was 3 years at the Naval Academy, so I wore a uniform for 39 years. There's another aspect of getting back in the Navy that causes you to think about it. The Navy won't promote you in the general line unless you have some percentage of sea duty. I was selected for commander, and I was a lieutenant commander, but I hadn't accomplished the sea duty, so they couldn't promote me to commander until I went to sea duty.
Hard to get in the X-15.
Yes.
Well, it turns out we had a squadron at China Lake. It was a fleet squadron. So technically that was sea duty. All they did was assign me to that squadron up at China Lake, and I stayed right in the same office I was in. And after a year, I had accumulated a year of sea duty, and they promoted me to commander.
Yes. That's where your command was, your squadron?
No, my squadron down Miramar.
Oh.
It was an F-8 fighter squadron.
Why did the Navy decide not to put another pilot into the program after you left?
They did. They sent a guy named Hoover out there. But I guess I would prefer that you not write about this, but for background, I'm willing to talk to you as you agree to that. I shouldn't say the fact that they sent a pilot you can write about, but why he didn't stay out there and so forth, I can say a couple of things about, but I really don't know. I'd rather you not write about what I'm saying in terms of why he didn't stay out there. He went out and came back within a month. I know no indications whatsoever that there was anything because of his qualifications or so forth. He came from Tuxedo River just like I did. He was on duty there at the time. I had talked to him. My impression is, and this is the thing that I'd like to be off the record, is that
Just a Okay.
And incidentally, in my case, when I went out there were all those preliminaries taken care of. They knew I was coming. I had been out there and made a courtesy call on all of them and talked to the boss and so on and so forth. So,
Right through channels.
Yes. Okay. Would you have liked to have seen the Navy stay in the program?
well, sure.
For one?
Sure. But the program character was changing at that time, as we discussed early, in that it was becoming more a platform to carry other experiments up, rather than they had achieved most of the research objectives that were originally set out for the airplane.
A lot of Navy pilots applied for astronaut training. Did you ever consider that?
They what?
Applied for astronaut training. I think we have more Navy astronauts than any other service.
Oh yeah. Well, I was in the X-15 program when that started. I never really seriously considered getting out of the X-15 program and trying to get in the astronaut program. One of the reasons being I was about 1.5 inches taller than their specifications were at that time. No, I felt I had my hands full and I enjoyed the program that I was on. And of course, in those early stages, it was not clear where the program was going.
How did you view the space program in comparison to the research aircraft program?
Initially, I think I had the same impressions that most of our people did, and I think an awful lot of people did, is that didn't want to be just a man in a can, which is what Joe Walker used to call it, a man in a can program. I think record indicates that those guys had a pretty tough time becoming pilots in the program. I think I probably entertained those same biases, if you will, and most people did. Although, I knew all those guys. Out of the first two groups, I think almost all of the Navy guys been students of mine at test pilot school or something. Al Shepard, a classmate of mine, and when I went to the X-15 program, he and I were sharing an office at the test pilot school, both of us instructing. I've known Al for 40 years. Pete Conrad, one of my students, all of those guys. And I knew them, and they're fine guys. Wally Schirra, they're all fine guys. I'm not casting any aspersions at those guys when I say that I entertain the biases of man in a can.
It's just the program, not the
Rather,
people.
probably was a good reason for me to rationalize why I didn't want to get out of the X-15 program and go join them in something that turned out to be a hell of a lot more important than the X-15 in the long run. But I was too tall for the Mercury program, and it wasn't going to be very long before I was going to be getting old enough that it would be a problem too.
How do you feel about the way the space program is now? You think it's come out a lot better than what it looked like it was starting out as?
Well, no, I think I'm talking about the early stages, These guys those first 7 were training, going through that whole process. And that was several years before, even Al Shepard got it, Redstone, and John Glenn. But, no, I think it's been an excellent program. Excellent.
Have you ever had a chance to see a launch at the Cape?
Oh, yeah, several. My wife went down the first launch on the space shuttle.
Yes, you've been down for
I saw several Apollo launches and a Mercury launch. I guess I didn't get down there during a Gemini launch. But no, I've seen a number of launches down
here. What are you involved with doing today?
I have a consulting firm, which is a one-man firm.
What do you do consulting about?
Aerospace activities. I try to keep involved in one major aircraft company, and a helicopter company, and an engine company, and a missile company. Those vary from time to time. Generally been able to do that, and I plan to do it for a few more years.
That's good. Do you still get a chance to fly a lot then?
No, I'm one of these guys that didn't have any trouble transitioning to a desk when the time came. And I have a son that flies in the back seat of F-14s, and I've got another one that's going to flight training here in a year or so, who's over at the Naval Academy now. And even while I was, the last several years I was on active duty, I didn't do much flying, because what I was doing was taking flying hours away from young guys who needed it a hell of a lot more than I did. And we are not providing enough time to most of our young pilots to keep them as ready as I think we should. Well, it would have been a selfish thing for me to do. I flew F-18 and Harrier and all of those things. Last year I was on active duty, but those were with somebody else. I did not go out and fly a lot, as a lot of people have to do. Some of them have to do it in order to stay sane or something. I've run into guys that just have to get in a cockpit. They cannot go to a desk and not go fly. But that was never, I didn't bother.
Do you think that there should be more of an emphasis, like there was in the 50s and early 60s, on a research aircraft program that we don't seem to have today?
I would say that I think we ought to have more national emphasis on aeronautical things, and research aircraft, I think, fall into that category than we have at the present time. Whether increased emphasis would result in a research aircraft program is something I think would have to be considered very carefully. But I do think that the things that NACA used to do on a national level, and which were so much a very vital part of our preeminence in aircraft design and so forth, are not being done today the way they should be done. There's more the fiscal limitations have caused them, and the extreme cost of the space program have resulted in a deterioration, I think, of our efforts in that respect. I'm not saying that's wrong, but I am concerned that we are not doing it. I'm not saying that those priorities I would necessarily disagree with, but I do think that we have not done it for enough years that we should devote more effort to aeronautical things rather than astronautical. A research airplane of some sort might be one of the things that you do if you increase that emphasis.
Was there anything else then, basically in conclusion, that anything that's really stood out about the X-15 program, any special moments on the aircraft, that things that happened we haven't already covered?
Not special moments, I don't think. I just thought it was a wonderful opportunity, a wonderful program, and I was extremely fortunate to be able to take part in it at the time. I was ready to do it.
Okay, well, I think I've pretty well covered everything. I don't want to keep
Let
you
me
too
take
much
you
longer.
down and let you look at a few pictures in case you haven't seen some of them that are downstairs. And I'll
Okay.
get you a bio.
Personally, I'm